Greetings all, I'm Sam Arano, and today we're going to talk about the family tree of the Hebrew language. If this video does well enough, I'm hoping that it'll make for an occasionally recurring series about the history of the Hebrew language and other Jewish languages, though keep in mind that Hebrew is the only one of them that I speak. Poorly. So to discuss Hebrew's origins, we need to go all the way back to the Afroasiatic language family. Afroasiatic is a top-level language family, which means that, as far as linguists currently agree, all Afroasiatic languages can be traced to a single theorized ancestral language simply called Proto-Afroasiatic. Now, that might give the impression that Proto-Afroasiatic spontaneously came into existence, with a community of people suddenly speaking a brand new language with no ancestors of its own. And that's certainly possible. We know that humans are able to create entirely new languages this way, even naturally. But the more likely explanation is that Proto-Afroasiatic is just one branch of an even larger family that otherwise went extinct. Now, all Afroasiatic languages have the distinguishing feature that their words are derived from literal roots. This means that words that revolve around a particular topic are just modifications of a common sequence of letters, originally consonants. For example, the Hebrew root kaf, tav, bet can be used to create words revolving around the act of writing: orthography, correspondence, a news article, or an address. In Hebrew, a single literal root can even be used to create 7 different types of verbs on a spectrum from most active to most passive. For example, lichtov is to write, while lehichtav is to be written, lehachtiv is to dictate, and lehitkatev is to correspond. Most popular descriptions of Afroasiatic languages will refer to literal roots as triliteral roots, as most of these roots take the form of 3 letters. But many of the most basic terms, the words you'd expect to be among the first created, actually use biliteral roots, or use irregular forms that exist somewhere in between. This helps us understand how the Afroasiatic languages evolved, because it means that the Proto-Afroasiatic culture already existed for quite a long time before branching off. As to where the original Afroasiatic culture came from, we can't be certain, but we can hypothesize by looking at the geographic distribution of its various branches. Afroasiatic is generally divided into 6 basic families: Berber, Egyptian, Chadic, Semitic, Cushitic, and Omotic. Again, this is very simplified. One shouldn't picture 6 different segments of the original culture wandering off and starting their own civilizations. This was a case of gradual bifurcation, and we're just not sure exactly how that happened. Most linguists agree that Omotic branched off first, probably followed by Cushitic, but there is no consensus whatsoever as to how the other 4 families branched off. The most popular theory goes like this. The original Proto-Afroasiatic culture lived roughly in the area of what is now eastern Sudan and western Ethiopia. At some point, the more southeasterly branches of that culture formed the Omotic and Cushitic languages, whereas the more northern and western branches formed the other 4 families. Now, looking at the map, it might seem like Ethiopia is a more likely candidate than Sudan because it also contains several native Semitic languages. But keep in mind that those Semitic languages probably actually arrived in Ethiopia later on from Arabia. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Intriguingly, all Proto-Afroasiatic languages have common roots for certain wild grains that would have been familiar to hunter-gatherer civilizations, but lack common roots used in agriculture. This suggests that Proto-Afroasiatic branched off into its constituent families before the advent of agriculture in the Near East. This makes Afroasiatic the oldest datable language family in the world. Linguist Christopher Ehret, a specialist in African languages at UCLA, believes that Afroasiatic began branching off as early as 14,000 years ago during the Neolithic period. So let's take a closer look at those 6 branches. Omotic, whose status as a branch of Afroasiatic isn't actually fully settled, includes a handful of minority languages in southwestern Ethiopia, the most commonly spoken of which is Wolaita, spoken by about 1.6 million Wolaita people. Cushitic is much more widely dispersed across the Horn of Africa, and its most popular language is Somali. The Chadic languages are spoken mainly in the Sahel region of West Africa, though don't take that to mean that Chadic languages, or any language family, dominates in that region, as the geography leads to a lot of mixing. On that note, The most commonly spoken Chadic language is Hausa, the main language of northern Nigeria, which, due to its proximity to the mostly tonal Niger-Congo languages, has actually incorporated tonality as a lexical feature. The Berber languages are spoken across the Sahara and even up to the Mediterranean coast of Africa, and exist along a fuzzier dialect continuum that makes individual languages harder to classify. Egyptian is Egyptian. It was the language of ancient Egypt, and though no version of it is spoken natively today, it has lived on as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church. And finally, we have Semitic, the family that put the Asiatic in Afroasiatic, as it is the only branch that is spoken in Asia and probably originated there. To keep things simple, Semitic has three main branches of its own. Eastern Semitic is the oldest attested Semitic language family. This is because its most commonly spoken form, Akkadian, was the first Semitic language to be written down, using cuneiform adapted from the previous Sumerian culture. It was also the first branch of Semitic to go extinct, as after conquering the nearby Assyrians, the Akkadians quite unusually adopted the language of the people they conquered, Aramaic, about which more later. Western Semitic is split into two groups. Southern Semitic most famously includes the Ge'ez, Amharic, Tigray, and Tigrinya languages of Ethiopia, as well as both the Old and New South Arabian languages. Before the Islamic conquests of the early medieval period, the native culture of southern Arabia actually had much more in common with Ethiopia than with the rest of Arabia, and in fact probably introduced the Semitic languages to the Ethiopian highlands. Cultural ties between Ethiopia and South Arabia remained strong throughout antiquity, a fact that I'm sure will become relevant again when I cover the history of Ethiopian Jews. And then we have Central Semitic, the language family that contains both Arabic and Hebrew. Much is made of the fact that Arabic and Hebrew are closely related, but this can be misleading. Arabic has preserved a much larger sound inventory from Proto-Central Semitic, whereas Hebrew has undergone multiple consonant mergers and sound shifts. The result is an example of asymmetric intelligibility. Generally speaking, it is easier for an Arabic speaker to understand Hebrew than for a Hebrew speaker to understand Arabic. But even that doesn't account for the phenomenon of false friends. Words shared between two languages that seem mutually intelligible, but whose meanings have shifted so that they're no longer equivalent. For example, Medina in Arabic means city, whereas in Hebrew, Medina means state or country. Similarly, the Arabic word for book is still kitab, using the Proto-Semitic root for writing, whereas the Hebrew word is sefer, using the root relating to storytelling. So even when Arabic and Hebrew seem mutually intelligible, the potential for misunderstanding is enormous, which is sensible considering the two languages' ancestors broke away from each other in the early Bronze Age. This brings us to Northwest Semitic, the family that includes Hebrew and another language said to be closely related to Hebrew, Aramaic. Although the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia are long gone, the Aramaic language still survives among the remnant Assyrian people, and their main religion, the Assyrian Catholic Church. Here, we find a language that actually is fairly intelligible with Hebrew. Even in ancient times, the authors of the Bible closely identified the origins of the Jews and Israelites with that of Aramaic-speaking peoples, such as the assertion of a patriarch Avraham who was born in Mesopotamia. However, as I said in my coverage of the First Temple period, there are certain biases to keep in mind here. The first is that almost all the authors of the Bible were living in a world in which Aramaic was already the lingua franca. Under King Yoshiao, under whom the writing of the Bible properly began, Assyria was Judah's main ally, and under Persian rule, when most of the Bible was written down, Aramaic was maintained as the language of state. The second caveat is that the authors of the Bible were working very hard to distance the Jews and Israelites from their actual closest linguistic relatives. Hebrew is a Canaanite language, and again, this is where we get into issues of what's a language and what's a dialect. Are Moabite, Edomite, and Ammonite dialects of Hebrew? Nobody can really say. In the famous words said by a student of Yiddish to the linguist Max Weinreich, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. But if the separate kingdoms of Israel and Judah can both be said to have spoken Hebrew, why not the others? Incidentally, the name Hebrew was probably originally an exonym. The literal root of Ivrit is aval, which means across, and probably originally referred to the people across, that is, west of, the Euphrates River. But there is an exception. To the north of the Kingdom of Israel were the Phoenician city-states. For most of the First Temple period, all of the Canaanite-speaking peoples lived very similarly. But by the beginning of the Second Temple period, their cultures had wildly diverged. The Jews and Samaritans, the descendants of the Israelites, had adopted monotheism and begun a diaspora into Mesopotamia and, to a lesser extent, Egypt, while the Phoenician state of Tyre had kept the old gods and expanded westward, establishing overseas colonies that had already broken away to become the Carthaginian Empire. And it is their native language, Punic, which is Hebrew's closest relative. So close, in fact, that if not for the divergence of their writing systems, a native Hebrew speaker today could probably read Punic almost as easily as the Bible. Carthage is really just a Latinization of the original Punic name Qad Hadasht, which means new town. In Hebrew, Qad Hadasht is Kiryat Hadashah. Meanwhile, the Spanish city of Córdoba was originally the Punic Qurtuba, good town. In Hebrew, this is Kiryat Tova. And finally, the most famous Carthaginian of all, Hannibal Barca, was in his own tongue Hannibal Barak. Baal is my grace thunder. In Hebrew, Hannibal Barak is Hannibal Barak. And with that out of the way, we now know Hebrew's place in the Afroasiatic language family. Special thanks to my patrons, including Eric Atreides, Jeremy Biskin, Osha Gordon, James Majors, Corey Ard, Matthew Brotman, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Brian Mechanic, Branch Ortiz, JP Strathausen, Navet Tal, Brian Tooten, Useful Charts, and Ur Weiss.